like this layout. It's cozy. Usually, like, when you get to talk, it's like a big auditorium and there's all this space between you and other people. And then you can get away with checking your phones when you're talking stuff. You can't, because I can see you up close. I'm going to fill in the space real quick. I'm going to feel it out when I get into it. I'm going to talk today about childhood and adulthood. Right? We're going to talk about what happens as we move from childhood to adulthood. We're going to talk about the things that stay the same and the things that change. And it's actually a really profound set of questions. Ones that you guys probably aren't thinking about too much because you're still in like this early chapter. But if we examine what happens between when we go from being a child to being an adult, what we're really investigating is all of the ways that we form our views of the world, all the ways that we develop our values, and ultimately the ways that we define our motivations, the things that lead us to live our lives the way we live our lives. And I feel like I have to apologize to a certain degree because some of the best answers, some of the most meaningful answers for what happens between when you move from childhood to adulthood, we can only find out by living out the rest of our lives. There's things that I can't explain to you, right? Because part of adulthood is kind of being able to see your childhood from a further, broader perspective. And growing up means you have collected more of time. You've collected more of life, right? And you look back and then you notice these patterns that have been taking place all through your life, right? Patterns in your motivations, your fears, patterns in the way that you've been doing things all along. And I can't guide you through that. You're just going to have to let life work itself on you, let time influence you. But there are things that we can make visible, right? The things that we can see by discussing these points. Rules, principles. There's rules and principles of this journey, right? Of our walk from childhood to adulthood. And in looking at these, we can kind of see the underlying forces at play. And hopefully, those will allow us to have a better sense of what we're doing, what's happening to us, and make better decisions in our lives. So we're going to talk about the movement from childhood to adulthood today. Is everybody cool with that? I feel like, I don't know, I sense a little bit of timidness, maybe a little bit of fear. You look like you need the bathroom, maybe. Maybe that's just how he takes intellectual conversation. Not you, I'm pointing that direction, not you. But before we talk about childhood to adulthood, we're going to talk about two other things. First, we're going to talk about communication, and we're going to talk about thinking. Because the mistake that we make often is that if we don't understand what we're doing when we're thinking and trying to understand the world, it's much more difficult to understand everything else, right? So first, if you'll indulge me, we're going to first talk about the nature of communication and then the nature of thinking. So communication. Communication. I'm going to go study communication in college. With T-Mobile, you get satellite communication and 5G. We talk about communication all the time. Communication, this word, is spread all across society, right? But rarely do we talk about what we're really doing. And that's why most of the time we make these very simple assumptions about communication. We think communication is all about how I package my ideas, right? How I take my thoughts, put them into different interesting shapes, and shove them into somebody else's brain. Take these thoughts, take, right? And, we think about communication almost like young parents, where they're trying to feed a baby, and they have a little spoonful of food, and they're like, eat the airplane, come on honey, eat the train. We feel like we just take what we're trying to shove in these people's mouths and we talk about it in this really cute way and then they'll listen to it, right? And sometimes they don't listen and we try to be more charming and they're like, eat the airplane, it's got Wi-Fi now. And sometimes the baby still doesn't want to eat. The parents get frustrated, right? They become a little pushy and a little manipulative, and they're like, honey, eat the airplane, these passengers will die. And that's how we look at communication. We think about, if I can just architect and engineer the best planes and the best trains, I can get them delivered into somebody else's mind. But that's not the most important part of communication. The most important part of communication is being able to understand the way the person you're talking to thinks. Right? The most important part of communication is understanding the way of thinking of your audience. Like today, for example, right? I jotted down notes, I put together thoughts, I try to make them pretty, I try to make them interesting. But before I did any of that, I had to consider you. I had to consider where you're at in life, how you see the world, right? I talked to my friend, what were you like in high school? What was that like? Oh, it's kind of geek, Other friends, they lied, like, oh, I had all these girls, you know what I'm saying? But the point being, I had to first investigate the landscape of your thinking so that I would recognize which thoughts of my own I could best produce, shape, and fit into the landscape of your thoughts. And that's communication, right? Communication isn't about taking these packages from our mind and shoving them into somebody else's mind. Take this, take it, eat my opinions, right? It's not that. Think about it like this, and this is where it gets interesting. Think about the thoughts as objects, right? Like three-dimensional shapes, right? And some of these shapes are simple, and some of them are complex, right? Some of them have geometric objects sticking out of them, parts sticking in, parts sticking out, right? And the point of communication is not to take these blocks and stick them into somebody's brain forcefully. Because you have to understand that somebody else's thoughts are also shapes, right? Somebody else's thoughts are also blocks, right? And in fact, the entire landscape of all of our thinking is just a landscape of shapes and structures, right? Patterns of shapes. And when you communicate, essentially what you're trying to do is take the shapes of your thinking and fit them perfectly with the shapes of somebody else's thinking, right? Let's use a visual example. Let's see it as like two planets. You have two planets, right? It's like some crazy sci-fi movie, right? And these two planets, on their surfaces, are all these crazy structures. Some parts stick out, some parts stick in, all these crazy structures. And both planets are in rotation. One planet is rotating faster than the other, right? And then at some point they engage, and it's like a game of 3D Tetris. And they try to find parts that interconnect, right? That's like communication, right? Like when you meet somebody and you're like, yo, this person really gets me, man. He laughs at all of my jokes. I like him. It's sort of a reflection that the shapes and the rhythm of your thinking is compatible with theirs, right? Think about when you first meet somebody, you're cycling through all of these different conversation points, right? Oh, you like football? Yeah, I like football. You like dancing? Oh, I forgot I said that. Right? But what you're essentially doing is you're rotating through the landscape of your shapes, right? And trying to find a part that connects. And from there, you build a deeper connectivity. Right? So this is what I would urge you to do as far as thinking goes. Some point in time, use your words not to try to put thoughts in other people's heads. Instead, use your communication to try to draw thoughts out of other people's minds so that you can see the landscape of their thinking. Think about it as a scientist who's trying to study an animal, right? So he puts food in front of the cage or the lair so that the animal will slowly come out so you can observe the body, the form, the nature of that animal. Because everybody's thought process, everybody's way of thinking is like its own creature, right? So let's talk a little bit about thinking now. We've talked about a way of thinking being sort of like a landscape of structures, patterns, of shapes, right? But how does this relate to the way that we interpret the world? How does this relate to the ideas that we have had? Well, in the same way that we make simplistic assumptions about communication, we make really simplistic assumptions about thinking. We think about thinking like it's just a conversation in our head, right? Let me think about this. As if we're just gathering all this information from the world, studying books, watching TV, observing the world, and sticking all this data in our heads. And then when we say, hey, let me think about it, it's like going into our brains and just sorting that information and pulling out a conclusion. That's what we assume thinking to be. But that's really, really misleading. It's really, really misleading. One of the things I want you to take away from this talk is what I'm about to say. Everything is thinking. Everything is thinking. Every part of our experience of this reality is a form of thinking, right? Because our brains gather all of the information of this reality and then it processes it, right? We touch, we smell, we taste, we do all kinds of weird stuff, but none of it matters until it's registered and processed and interpreted in the brain. So if our brain processing information is thinking, then what is it, right? It's like the smell and the taste of your favorite food, right? The feeling of your bed, even the image of your parents' faces, even the way you feel as you watch these faces slowly change, age, all different forms of thinking, right? The rational, the logical, the analytical, but also the feeling, the sensations from our senses. Also our emotions. Aren't these all just different ways to inform us about what reality is? So there's just different forms of thinking, right? It's not just the stuff that you pull out from books when you're cramming, for an exam, or, the math problems that you do, the physics projects. That's not the only form of thinking. But when you go out on a hot day, you feel the heat against your skin. That's a way of thinking about the sun, right? When you're sitting in class next to somebody and maybe you have a crush on them, you like them so much, you act a little creepy and you lean over and you smell it. Don't act like you don't do it. I know some of you have done it, right? But you lean over and you smell them. The smell. See, this is the stuff that's going to last. What was that talking about? He's talking about smelling people. He's talking about smelling people. You like it's dumb. Right? No, but the smell of that person is a way of thinking about that person, right? Eavesdropping in the conversation. Look over as they go through their little Facebook profile, right? Right? The images you associate with them, the texture of their voice, the nature of their laughter, these are all different ways you think about that person, right? So, a person's way of thinking is the complete and comprehensive way that they interpret and model this world, this reality. It's everything, right? It's all of the different patterns that they recognize. It's the symbols that they see. It's the symbols that they don't see, right? It's the reason one person will see certain things in a particular situation and another person won't. And it's also why if you take 1,000 people and you put them in the same situation, you're going to get 1,000 unique interpretations. But how does this have to do with communication, with the words that we use? And how does this have to do with the actual formation of thoughts? Well, I think you can think about it like this. We've talked about how a thought is like a structure, right? A thought is like a structure, it's like a shape. And words, the words that we use, aren't they just sort of like stickers that we put on the shapes? Right? We take this word, we stick it on top of this thought, and we reference this thought every time we use that word, right? And how are these thoughts created? How are they created? They're created from gathering all the impressions that we have of a particular thing in reality, in the world, right? And then integrating them together into this structure. An example will make it easier to understand. Let's use the word ocean for example. Ocean. Right? The word ocean is a label for the structure. It's model in your mind for what the ocean is. And that structure in your mind is made of every single impression you've gathered from encountering the ocean. Right? That time you went to the ocean and you saw that mysterious synchronicity on its surface in the movement of the water. The texture and the temperature of the body of the ocean when you swam in it. Right? The things that you read about the plants and the animals that live inside the ocean, all of these things are integrated together and they create the structure and the thought of the ocean. And let's have a different example. Let's take two different people, person A and person B. Person A grew up next to the ocean, right? So as a child, he would go and spend weekdays and weekends sitting against the ocean and looking into it, right? And in moments of difficulty, he would stand against the ocean, he would ponder life, right? And the day that his mother died, he ran to the ocean, he cried into it. Person A. Take person B. Person B's never been to the ocean. Person B lives landlocked. The only time person B's ever experienced the ocean is through television and magazines, right? Both of these people can use the word the ocean. Both of these people can say to you, the ocean is beautiful. But think how differently their structures of thought are based on what they've experienced. And it's not just the ocean or the continent of Europe or President Barack Obama that are thoughts in our mind, but like the tone of your parents' voice, for example, right? When they're making you feel bad about doing something. Why did you give us 91 hours? You should have done 99 I'm going to tell your father stop feeding me. That's a thought. That's a structure of thought in your head. It's hard to find a word to perfectly describe that thought, but that thought is made of impressions, right? The tone of your parents' voice, the aggression and the things that they say, your own feelings of guilt and suffering that make that structure, right? So, let's summarize a bit everything that we talked about. Let's summarize a bit everything we talked about. Everything is thinking, right? All of the different ways that we gather the impressions of reality, right? The rational, the analytical, the logical way we explain things, and then the way that we feel things through sensations, through emotions. These are all just different ways that we're informed about what all of this is, right? And so we take these impressions, we gather them in our minds, we organize them, we architect and integrate them into these structures, and these structures are our thoughts, right? And then we label these thoughts with words. Like your mother labels the sugar, or your mother or your father, right? It's a gender-neutral conversation. Whoever labels the sugar. But that's how we label our thoughts, with these words. And then when we communicate, right, in using words, we're essentially trying to take the shapes of our structures and find harmony, right, between the geometry of our thinking and the geometry of somebody else's. Right? So that gives us somewhat of a foundation to understand thinking and understand communication. Now, what is childhood? What is adulthood? What happens as we move from one state to the other? What are the things that change? What are the things that stay the same? If you talk to little kids, it's really fascinating, right? Because little kids, they say crazy things, you know? But the fact that they're able to say some really profound words means that they're trying to model these thoughts already in their minds, right? Right? Little kids are talking about life, they're talking about death, they're talking about God, they're talking about the universe, they're talking about love. 7, 8, 9. Love. And it reflects the fact that you're trying to model these thoughts in their mind, you know, especially today, because information is everywhere. And the more information there is, the more words there are. And when kids pick up these words, they start trying to conceive of what they mean, right? So it's crazy. You'll meet like a 7, 8, 9-year-old kid, and you'll say something innocent. You're like, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they'll be like, well, I know that I don't want a wife that's too career-oriented. You know, that happened to me one time. That happened to me at a picnic, you know? And I just looked at it, I was like, son, are you potty trained? Right? But the thing is, you know, when you see little kids trying to talk about government and politics and war and marriage and career-focused people, right? You know that their models, their structures for these thoughts are simplistic, right? They're not mature, right? It's easy to see 7, 8, 9-year-old kids. But what about you guys? What about you guys? What about these big words that you guys are using now, right? Career, purpose, life, love, right? You guys are talking these words, right? I know you are. At that age, you are. You think you know so much about your career. You think you know so much about life and so much about love, right? Let's take a word like career, right? You guys have a conception. You guys have a structure in your mind to model what a career is and everything that it means. Now compare that with a 40-year-old doctor, let's say, right? And she's slaved her entire life, made numerous sacrifices to build her career. Now she's this prestigious doctor, right? You're talking about days and nights and days and nights of work and self-sacrifice and brutality and pain. Because it is. When you really work for something professionally, there's pain. And now she's this prestigious doctor, and she feels good about herself and her salary, but at the same time, she's under enormous pressure. Right? She's had to sacrifice all of her friends. She can't hang out. She can't have Starbucks with her friends, you know? And worst of all, the worst part is that she has no time for her husband and her daughter. Think about the structure of the word career in her mind, right? All of the sacrifice, all of the glory, all of the pain, all of the burden, all of the time, all of the self-questioning, all of the wondering, is this what I really, really want out of my life? And compare that with how you conceive of career. Think about love, being in love, right? You guys have some sense of what it means to be in love, you know. You guys feel like you do, especially boys at your age. Boys at this age always feel like, you know, I'll tell you about the ladies, right? High school boys, right? That's what you guys are like, you know. That's what I was like. Somebody disagrees. Right? Think about your understanding of the word love, and then let's take somebody who's 40 and somebody who met this woman in his 20s. He was just enamored of it, right? And they had this connection, this gravity between them that pulled them together, and this desire to care for one another and generate this affection and this oneness, right? So they got married in their 20s. And as they got older, because the 20s is a period of intense change, you get a job, you start going down a particular path, both of them started to change a lot. And as they changed, they were less compatible, less harmonious. So this once intense affection started to become conflict, right? And coldness and disappointment. And they live with that for years and years, and then at a certain point in time, he meets this other woman. And again, he feels that thing he hasn't felt for years, this affection, this draw, this gravity to another person. Right? But he also feels guilt because he's still married. Think about your structure, your model, your understanding for love and being in love, and compare it with this person. Right? How qualified do you guys think you are to talk about career? How qualified do you guys think you are to talk about love? To talk about these grand ideas of life? Picture huge rocks, right? Huge rocks, right? Picture huge rocks at the top of a mountain, right? And these rocks are in constant conversation with the sun and the rain. Over the many, many, many years, the rain comes and it just beats against the rocks and it carves it in unique angles and unique shapes, like rain does. And in the absence of the storms, the sun is there, and the sun heats the rocks and infuses the rocks with heat energy and fosters the growth of moss and plant life on the surface of the rocks. These big rocks are like the big thoughts of our lives, right? Life, death, love, meaning, happiness, purpose. When you're young, they're still big, but they're very simple. Their shape is very simple. And the rain and the sun, these are like the elements of life experience that come and give texture, and give shape, and give form, and give density, and give weight to these thoughts. But there's a beauty, there's a power in simplicity, right? There's a power in simplicity. When your thoughts are simple and when they're light, they're easier to juggle. They're easier to play with, right? The belief in being able to change the world is a lot easier when the model for the idea of the world has not become so heavy and dense. And that's one of the powers of being young. That's one of the powers of childhood. That's why little kids, they dream about the craziest, boldest stuff. They don't want to be CEOs of companies. They don't want to make millions of dollars. They want to be superheroes. They want to fly. Why don't I want to own a company? I want to fly. I want to do what Spider-Man does. I don't care about Steve Jobs. You know, Spider-Man, right? So little kids dream boldly, and what happens to adults a lot of the times is they've been subjected to the same patterns of thinking, right? And their thinking becomes so dense and so heavy. You have to be like this. You have to be like this. The impressions are the same over and over and over. And adults, sometimes their thoughts become rigid. They become stiff. And adults lose the ability to think of newness, to think of a new way of approaching life, to think of new possibilities for the world. That happens to a lot of adults, but it doesn't have to. So one of your homework assignments, and the lesson of this part of the talk is take some time to reflect on when you were younger, just a little bit younger, and how possible the world felt, how open it was, how these thoughts about all of these structures that define the world were so light, you could juggle them, put them apart, pull them together, make castles, you know, make battleships, make whatever. Because you don't have to lose that flexibility, right? You only lose that flexibility when you forget to use it, right? You don't have to ever relinquish the belief that life can be something that you can innovate with, right? That your thoughts are things that can change, they can bend, and they're not static, they're not stiff, they're not stuck, right? So how do things stay the same? How do things stay the same between childhood and adulthood? Well, let me ask this. Think about your lives. Think about the things that motivate you. Getting good grades, I want to get to live in this school, you know. I'd like to get this on my resume, I want to do this internship. Where do these motivations come from? Right? It's not like little babies are born wanting to do internships and get straight A's. I hope not. Like a horrible dystopian future. Right? It's not like you're born with these motivations. Where do they come from? Let's look at what a motivation is. Isn't a motivation sort of like an internal gravity? Right? It's an internal gravity that pulls you towards certain things and it pulls you away from other things. Right? What does it pull you towards? It pulls you towards things you feel good about. Right? And those things are the things that you value. That's what motivations do. They pull you towards doing these things. These things make me feel good. Those are the things that you value. And ultimately, the reason that you move towards your motivations is because they make you feel good about yourself. And they make you feel good about the life that you're living, right? But where do they come from? We still haven't answered that question. Where do motivations come from? Well, Motivations are forged, right? Imagine like a blacksmith who's working some sort of project, hammering. Your reality forges your motivations just like that. Right? Starting with your parents, and then your friends, and then the society around you. They exert forces onto you, right? Like we talked about gathering impressions from reality. They direct impressions towards you that shape what you feel good about and what you feel bad about, right? Like when your parents are like, hey, why didn't you get higher than a 95 on this test, right? Why didn't you? And the way that they convey that to you is shaping you to feel good about getting better than a 95 and feel bad about getting worse than a 95, right? You almost have no choice. Your parents are so strategic in the way that they do it. And what's happening is from a very young age, your motivations are being defined by a mapping out, right? These forces that help you map out, this is what I'm going to feel good about, and this is what I'm going to feel bad about. And this polarity, this is where that gravity takes place, right? That gravity of your motivation is going this way, right? And at first it starts with your parents, but then it's like your friends. Your friends are like, oh, this band is awesome, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that internship, and you're like, oh, maybe I should. Not necessarily because you've experienced or interpreted it for yourself, because somebody else has informed you, I should feel good about this. I should do that. I should do this. And then there's society and there's media, right? Subtly, through commercials and all kinds of messages, right? It's like, hey, the fashion industry says you should feel good about looking like this and feel bad about looking like this. The entertainment industry says if you're white or black or Asian, you should look like this and dress like this and you will feel good. Look at all of these lights. Look at these cameras. Look at this flash. You should feel good about this and feel bad if you don't look like it. And what's curious about this, the formation of our motivations, is that when you stop and you really look at it, by the time that we're an adult, so many things that we're doing, right, have been defined by other people's values and other people's forces that they pushed upon you, right? But still, that game of pursuing things that you feel good about, right, which is ultimately just allowing yourself to feel good about your own life, finding value in the way that you live, that game doesn't change from childhood to adulthood. Right? This process that you're on now, the things that you feel good about, the things that you allow yourself to pursue because they make you feel good, these are going to shape the things that you feel good about for the rest of your life. And the most important part of this is, based on our discussion, we see that so much of it is informed by other people, right? If I'm letting my mom and my dad and all of my friends and then the fashion industry and the entertainment industry and the business industry and capitalism tell me what I feel good and I feel bad about, am I free? Isn't that like a form of slavery, letting somebody else define what you feel good about within yourself, within your own life? Letting somebody else define what you're motivated to do, right? And that's the lesson of this part of the talk, right? Is that you need to pay attention and look at the sources of your motivations. The sources of the things that make you feel good and the sources of the things that make you feel bad. Because if you have a back pain, you go to the chiropractor and he tells you, hey, you have this back pain because you're sitting this way and you need to stop sitting this way and he'll fix it. If you have a stomach pain, you go to the internal medicine person and they're like, hey, you need to stop eating this type of diet, right? Because this is what's causing, this is the source of this bad feeling. But in life, very rarely do we sit and discuss, why am I feeling bad about this? Why am I feeling good about this? What are the sources for the things I feel good about and what are the sources for the things I feel bad about? Because let me tell you, as I said, that game remains for the rest of your life. That game of trying to do things that make you feel good about yourself. Little kids, they get A's, because they know it's going to make their parents feel a certain way. It's going to make their friends look at them a certain way, right? They do projects, they get trophies because the reaction that they're going to get, and it makes them feel good about themselves. Adults get jobs, right? They buy cars, they get fancy titles for the same reason, because the way that it allows them to feel about themselves, right? And so it's important as early as possible to start to understand the things that are shaping what you feel good about and what you feel bad about. And that happens by slowing down the way that you live life. Slow it down, slow it down. Don't just rush and run through. You guys are rushing and running. It's like, I want to get to college. I'm going to get to college. I'm going to get to college. I'm going to get a dorm. It's going to be awesome in a dorm. Right? I know what that was like. You want to go and you want to party and you want to live by your own and blah, 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 and write blogs about it. But what I'm saying is slow down the way that you think about life. Observe the things that are happening. Hey, when my parents say this type of thing, to me, it makes me feel kind of worthless and bad. When my boyfriend behaves in this kind of way, it makes me feel kind of weak. When my friends do these type of things to me, it makes me feel stronger and more confident. Pay attention to those things, because those are the things that define what you feel good about within yourself, what you feel value about within your own life. So, to conclude, in this sort of model that I shared with you, we talk about how everything is thinking. All of our life experience are different forms of thinking. And now that I've gotten older, I also like to think about this entire journey of our lives, from childhood to adulthood, is just different forms of childhood. In childhood, you guys are given all of the raw tools you need to live a powerful and healthy and happy life, right? You're informed as to how to care, how to feel, how to play, and how to enjoy the world. You're informed as to, how to be inspired by the colors and the movement and the personality of the world. And there's basically two types of influences that you encounter along the road, right? One type of influence supports and strengthens these raw tools for you to be inspired, for you to feel more deeply, for you to care more, right? For you to enjoy the world more. The other type of influence damages and sometimes even destroys these raw gifts that we've been given, right? And so part of the reason I structured my talk the way I did today is because I wanted to help you understand how these influences work. And maybe more importantly, I wanted to let you know that throughout life, as a child and as an adult, the ultimate goal is the same. And it's to feel good about who you are. To find value in the life that you live. It doesn't matter if you have crazy amounts of money and you have some title that everybody else is jealous of. If you don't feel good about it, it doesn't matter. That's not success. Right? So as you move forward in life, as you take new classes and learn new subjects, as you're trained in new skills and new tasks, right? I say to remember these raw tools. Right? Remember the lessons that you got from childhood that basically were given to you without ever having to take a class. So preserve these lessons and to carry them with you as you walk through the journey ahead. Thank you.